In the humble Mayan village near Coba, Quintana Roo, the trembling hands of Manuel Jibkovich held the weight of 3 decades of silence. It was November of 2024, and at 49 years old, this man, marked by time and guilt, had made the most difficult decision of his life. With slow, deliberate movements, he knelt beside the family altar, where a photo of his late wife, Rosa, watched him with the same smile that always told him everything would be all right. But nothing had been all right since that night in July of 1994. Manuel began to dig with his bare hands into the loose earth, slowly revealing a cedar wood box he had buried exactly 30 years ago. The scent of damp earth and time itself emanated from it as he lifted the lid. Inside, wrapped in yellowed plastic, lay 15 passports from different nations, a Nikon camera with its film still undeveloped, and a small notebook filled with names scrawled in a shaky hand. Photographs he never dared to develop. They captured the final moments of 15 souls who came seeking the magic of the Mayan cenotes and found only death. The hand-drawn map showed the exact location of the cenote, with markings only he could understand. Here, the first one fell. Over there, 3 tried to escape. In this spot, the youngest one hid before they found her. And at the bottom of the box, a letter. One he had written and rewritten 1,000 times over 30 years, addressed to the families of the disappeared. A letter never sent, choked by the terror that seized his throat every time he considered the consequences. Tears streamed freely down Manuel's weathered face as he touched each passport. Jennifer Harrison, 35, from San Francisco. Her husband Michael, same age, same city. They had come to celebrate their 8th anniversary by exploring Mayan culture. Sarah Chen, 28, a photographer with a brilliant future. Klaus and Greta Hoffmann, the German couple who loved pre-Columbian art and paid for that love with their lives. Pierre Dubois, the French writer who documented everything. Isabella Rossi, the Italian student who dreamed of preserving cultural heritage. Eric Johansson, the Swedish diver whose skills condemned him. Ana Sousa, the Portuguese journalist always searching for the story behind the story. Carlos and Maria Delgado, the Argentine newlyweds on a honeymoon that became a funeral. Roberto Mendez, the only Mexican in the group who spoke Mayan and therefore saw too much. Carmen Silva, the Brazilian curator who recognized the value of what they should never have found. And Lisa Anderson, just 24 years old, a recent graduate with her whole life ahead of her. Manuel had survived, but every day since had been a slow death. His wife, Rosa, was gone, taken by cancer 6 years ago, and with her, the only love that had anchored him to this world. His 3 children, now adults, had moved to Cancun seeking opportunities, visiting him less and less, unable to understand the weight their father carried. Diabetes had come like a divine punishment, his body deteriorating just as guilt had eroded his soul. He no longer feared the men who had threatened him for 3 decades. The hitmen who once tried to kill him were now respectable businessmen, or in their graves. Don Alberto, the monster who orchestrated it all, had died in his bed, surrounded by luxuries bought with blood. But the dead would not let him rest. Every night, 15 faces visited his dreams, not with blame but with silent pleas. Sarah Chen would show him her camera, as if asking why he never developed her last photographs. The Harrisons would appear holding hands, just as they were when they were thrown into the cenote. Lisa Anderson would cry in the same corner where she hid before they found her. And all of them, every single one, asked the same thing with their empty eyes. Tell our story. And so, Manuel contacted an investigative journalist in Mexico City, taking precautions taught by 30 years of fear. Calls from public phones, meetings in crowded markets, documents delivered through intermediaries. Even now, with almost all the culprits dead or old, the terror made his right hand unconsciously reach for the scar on his left side, the mark from the machete that nearly silenced him forever in August of 1994. For 30 years, Manuel Jibkovich kept a secret that ate away at him like the cancer that took his wife. A secret about 15 souls who sought the mystical beauty of the sacred Mayan cenotes and found instead a brutal death at the hands of looters who desecrated ancient tombs. Now more afraid of dying in silence than of the killers who still roam the Riviera Maya. He has decided that the world must know that the Caribbean paradise was built on the blood of innocence and the plunder of ancient gods. If you've ever taken a cenote tour in the Riviera Maya, this story will chill you to the bone. A surviving witness is finally speaking out after 30 years of terror. Subscribe and turn on all notifications because what Manuel is about to reveal will change how you see tourism in the Mexican Caribbean. Hit the like button to support brave witnesses. Comment if you've ever felt something strange on a tour to a remote location. The Riviera Maya of 1994 was a world away from the mega resort we know today. Playa del Carmen was still a sleepy fishing village, where hippies and backpackers outnumbered package tourists. Its famed Fifth Avenue was just a dirt track lined with a few palapas and small shops. Tulum consisted of a single unpaved main street where stray dogs slept in the midday sun, and the only hotels were rustic cabins with no electricity. Between these two towns stretched a dense, virgin, mysterious jungle, dotted with unexplored cenotes and Mayan ruins that the vegetation had reclaimed over centuries. It was a paradise for adventurers seeking authenticity, and the perfect tomb for those who might disappear into its depths. The tourism boom was just beginning to stir. Visionary investors were buying land at prices that would seem ridiculous now, paying Mayan landowners pitiful sums for acres that would be worth millions within a decade. The grand hotels were still just blueprints on architects' desks in Miami and Mexico City. But beneath the surface of this nascent development, another industry flourished in the shadows. The systematic and ruthless looting of Mayan archaeological sites. Every new hotel that was built uncovered ancient tombs. Every new road that was cut revealed stelae and monuments. And there was a hungry international market willing to pay a fortune for these pieces. Private collectors in New York, discreet museums in Tokyo, European tycoons with vaults full of stolen treasures. Mayan art was traded like gold, and there were those willing to do anything to obtain it. The drug cartels had not yet fully dominated the region as they would later. These were the golden years of the professional huaqueros, tomb raiders with international connections who moved archaeological pieces with the same efficiency others moved cocaine. They had corrupt archaeologists who identified the sites, excavation teams that worked by night, smuggling networks that moved the pieces out of the country, and above all, effective methods for silencing any inconvenient witnesses. This was the context in which mystical Maya tours operated. On paper, it was an agency offering exclusive experiences for wealthy tourists interested in the real Mayan culture. Their brochures promised access to places no other tour visited. Virgin cenotes where no one else had swum, ruins still hidden by the jungle. They advertised small groups, 15 people, to preserve the authenticity of the experience, and local guides who spoke Mayan and knew the ancient legends. It seemed like a dream for any cultured traveler who despised mass tourism. The reality was far more sinister. Mystical Maya Tours was the perfect front operation for reaching unexplored archaeological sites. They used the tourists as cover for their looting expeditions. If they found something valuable and the tourists saw nothing incriminating, perfect. But if the visitors saw too much, if they asked too many questions, if they took pictures of the wrong things, well, the Mayan jungle was vast and the cenotes were very deep. Accidents happened. The group that departed on July 22, 1994, was internationally diverse, each member with their own reasons for choosing this adventure, none suspecting it would be their last. There were 5 Americans. Jennifer and Michael Harrison, both 35, were a San Francisco couple who shared a passion for amateur archaeology. They had visited Angkor Wat, Machu Picchu, the pyramids of Egypt. The cruel irony is that their knowledge and love for ancient cultures was precisely what condemned them. They knew too much about the value of artifacts. They recognized an illegal excavation when they saw one. Sarah Chen, 28, was a rising star in the world of documentary photography. She had worked for National Geographic, and her trained eye knew the difference between a legitimate dig and a looting operation. She traveled with 2 professional cameras, obsessively documenting everything. Every photograph she took was a death sentence she didn't know she was signing. Robert Miller, a 45-year-old anthropology professor from UC Berkeley, was on sabbatical. He was a meticulous academic who took notes on everything, asked uncomfortable questions, and connected dots others missed. His notebook, which Manuel kept all these years, contained observations that would have exposed the entire operation. Lisa Anderson, the youngest of the Americans at just 24, was a recent art history graduate traveling on her trust fund. She seemed like the perfect tourist, young, naive, wealthy, but she had the youthful enthusiasm that made her wander where she shouldn't. The 6 Europeans each brought a dangerous element to the mix. Klaus and Greta Hoffmann, 40 and 38, were German collectors of pre-Columbian art, all legal with certificates and permits. But that was exactly why they could identify an authentic piece, knew the black market prices, and understood the true value of what they were seeing. Their knowledge made them witnesses who were far too dangerous. Pierre Dubois, 33, was a French writer for Lonely Planet. His literal job was to discover hidden places and tell the world about them. Isabella Rossi, a 29-year-old Italian, was a doctoral student in archaeological conservation. She knew how sites should be handled and could recognize the damage caused by looters. Eric Johansson, a 31-year-old Swede, was a professional cave diver. His skills made him dangerous because he could explore parts of the cenotes that were supposed to remain unseen. And Ana Souza, a 26-year-old from Portugal, was every clandestine operation's nightmare, a freelance journalist always digging for the story behind the story. 4 Latin Americans completed the condemned group. Carlos and Maria Delgado, 30 and 28, were an Argentine couple on their honeymoon. He was a geologist, she an anthropologist, the perfect combination to understand both the cenote formations and the cultural value of what they contained. Roberto Mendez, a 42-year-old from Mexico City, was the only one who spoke Mayan in addition to Spanish and English. He could understand the whispers between the local guides. Carmen Silva, a 34-year-old Brazilian, was a curator at the Sao Paulo Museum of Art. Her trained eye would immediately recognize a museum-quality piece, its provenance, and its value. And then there was Manuel Jibkovic, the local guide, barely 19 years old. He came from a traditional Mayan family that had lived in the region for generations. His grandfather had taught him the locations of cenotes no map showed, sacred places that were meant to remain hidden. For mystical Maya tours, he was the perfect employee. He knew the secret places but was young and naive enough not to understand the tour's true purpose. Manuel's boss, the man everyone knew as Don Alberto, was in reality Alberto Sanchez Monteverde, a 55-year-old with a respectable facade and connections to the highest levels of state government. Officially, he was a visionary tourism entrepreneur. Unofficially, he was one of the biggest traffickers of Mayan art in the Western Hemisphere. He used his tour agency as an exploration method, and if tourists saw something they shouldn't, Don Alberto had methods to ensure their permanent silence. 15 people from different countries, each with dreams and families, united by a love for adventure and Mayan culture. They didn't know they had bought tickets to their own execution. If this story is impacting you, share it now. Like if you believe the victims deserve justice. Comment with your country and if you know anyone who has disappeared on a tour. July 22, 1994, dawned with the humid heat typical of a Caribbean summer. At 6 a.m., two air-conditioned Toyota Hiace vans waited outside the mystical Maya Tours office in Playa del Carmen. The 15 tourists arrived on time, excited, their backpacks filled with water, bug repellent, and cameras. Some had met at their hostel in previous days. Others were introducing themselves for the first time. The energy was palpable, that electric buzz before an adventure that promises to be unforgettable. And unforgettable it would be, though not in the way any of them expected. Manuel remembers every detail of that morning with the cruel clarity that comes with trauma. He was nervous. It was his biggest tour to date. Don Alberto had insisted that he lead one of the vans, though he usually worked as an assistant. In his van were the 5 North Americans and the 4 Latin Americans. The other van was driven by Joaquin Herrera, a 35-year-old veteran guide who had been working for Don Alberto for 5 years. Joaquin knew precisely what kind of operation his boss was running. He'd been on the looting expeditions before. He knew the price of silence. That morning, Joaquin was unusually quiet, downing coffee after coffee, smoking cigarette after cigarette. Don Alberto himself appeared to see the group off, a rare occurrence, dressed in his impeccable white guayabera and the dark glasses he never removed. He shook each tourist's hand, smiling with a false warmth he had perfected over years. But when he reached Joaquin, he whispered something that made the veteran guide turn visibly pale. Manuel, standing nearby, caught only 2 words: avocado procedure. He didn't know what it meant, but the way Joaquin swallowed told him it was nothing good. The official plan was to visit 3 pristine cenotes over 2 days, camp one night in the jungle, and watch the sunrise from an unexcavated Mayan ruin. The tourists were captivated by the promise of an authentic experience, far from the crowds. Jennifer Harrison had brought her Hi8 video camera, the latest technology for 1994, and was obsessively recording everything. Sarah Chen had already burned through 2 rolls of film before they even left Playa del Carmen. Robert Miller was filling his first notebook with observations on the blend of Spanish colonial and modern Mayan architecture. At 8:30, they arrived at the first cenote of the day, one the locals called Excava, though it appeared on no tourist map. Reaching it required a 40-minute trek along a path barely distinguishable from the jungle floor. Manuel walked ahead with his machete, clearing the way when necessary. The tourists were thrilled with the authenticity of it all. Klaus Hoffmann remarked that this was what they had come for, not the commercialized cenotes filled with tourists in flip-flops. The Excava cenote was spectacular. A perfect oval of crystalline water surrounded by limestone walls draped in ferns and vines. Sunlight filtered through the opening above, creating an almost mystical effect. The tourists put on their snorkel gear with childlike excitement. Eric Johansson, with his professional diving equipment, was the first to submerge completely, exploring the underwater caverns with the skill of long experience. It was Eric who made the first problematic discovery. About 15 meters down, in a side cavern, he found several pieces of Mayan pottery. He brought them to the surface with the enthusiasm of an amateur archaeologist. Isabella Rossi examined them with an expert eye, confirming they were authentic, likely from the late classic period. The group's excitement was palpable. Carlos Delgado suggested they document everything and report it to the National Institute of Anthropology and History. Carmen Silva was already taking notes on the artifact's features. Joaquin's reaction was immediate and violent. He snatched the ceramics from Eric's hands and hurled them back into the water. When the confused group protested, Joaquin delivered a sermon on the importance of not disturbing sacred Mayan sites, of respecting the ancestors. The abashed tourist nodded, promising not to touch anything else. But Manuel saw something different in Joaquin's eyes. It wasn't cultural reverence. It was fear. Fear that the tourists would find something they were not meant to see. At midday, as they headed toward the second cenote, fate intervened in the cruelest possible way. Carlos Delgado, with his geologist's eye, noticed an unusual rock formation partially hidden by vegetation. He insisted on investigating, dragging his new wife Maria along with him. The others, curious, followed. Manuel tried to dissuade them, saying they were straying from the itinerary, but the group's curiosity was stronger than his caution. What Carlos had found would change everything. Behind a curtain of vines and ferns was a sealed entrance, clearly man-made. The stones had been deliberately placed to conceal something. Roberto Mendez, thrilled, identified Mayan glyphs on the upper stones. He wasn't an expert, but he recognized the basic symbols. This was a tomb, and from the state of the vegetation it had been untouched for centuries. Joaquin tried desperately to talk them out of it. He told them it was dangerous, that there could be traps, that it was illegal to disturb archaeological sites. But the group was beyond the point of no return. Carefully, almost reverently, they began to remove the stones from the entrance. Sarah Chen documented every moment, her camera capturing what would be the last hours of their lives. Pierre Dubois took frantic notes, already imagining the chapter this would merit in his next guidebook. The tomb's interior was more than any of them could have imagined, an intact burial chamber from the Mayan classic period. The remains of what had been a nobleman or priest lay in the center, surrounded by offerings. Jade was everywhere, along with obsidian masks and polychrome pottery whose colors had survived 1,000 years in darkness. Isabella Rossi, nearly weeping with emotion, murmured about the discovery's importance to Mesoamerican archaeology. Klaus Hoffmann, ever the pragmatist, couldn't help but calculate the value. Aloud, he speculated that on the black market this would be worth millions. He immediately corrected himself, saying that of course they would never consider such a thing, but the damage was done. He had spoken the forbidden words: black market, millions. Joaquin stepped away from the group and took out his radio. He told them he was going to report the find to the authorities, that it was his duty. The tourists applauded his integrity, but Manuel, who was closer, heard the real conversation. Joaquin wasn't calling any authorities. The voice on the other end was unmistakable, Don Alberto, and the message, though coded, was clear. The birds have found the nest. I repeat, the nest is full. Don Alberto's response, though not fully understood, chilled Manuel's blood. Avocado procedure, wait for the moon. The afternoon passed in a blur of euphoria and frantic activity. The tourists were torn between documenting the find and debating what to do. The Harrisons wanted to contact the Mexican authorities and the University of Berkeley immediately. Sarah Chen had already shot 6 rolls of film and wanted to find a way to send them to National Geographic that very night. The Hoffmans insisted that everything be done according to proper protocol to prevent the pieces from ending up on the black market, a world they knew all too well. They set up camp near the Cenote, the third and deepest on their itinerary. At 60 meters deep, With a network of underwater caverns no one had fully mapped, the Chaak was considered one of the most dangerous cenotes in the region. The local Maya avoided it, saying it was a direct entrance to Xibalba, the underworld. If only they knew it would soon become exactly that for 15 innocent souls. Manuel prepared dinner on autopilot. He cooked cochinita pibil the traditional way, burying the seasoned pork wrapped in banana leaves under hot embers. It was his grandmother's recipe, and normally he loved sharing this tradition with tourists. But tonight, every bite tasted like ash in his mouth. He noticed Joaquin didn't touch his food, feigning a stomachache. He also noticed that Joaquin had marked several trees with phosphorescent paint, supposedly so they wouldn't get lost in the dark. Manuel wasn't a fool. He knew those marks weren't for them. At 10 o'clock, with the full moon glowing over the jungle, Joaquin suggested something that, in retrospect, was an obvious trap. He proposed a nighttime exploration of the Cenote, a mystical experience under the moonlight. The ancient Maya, he explained, believed the cenotes revealed their secrets only under a full moon. The tourists, already intoxicated with the day's discovery, enthusiastically agreed. Even those who might normally have been more cautious, like Robert Miller, were so absorbed in the adventure that they ignored the warning signs. They put on their headlamps and followed Joaquin down the path to the cenote. Manuel trailed at the back of the group, each step feeling like a walk to the gallows. The Chaak cenote at night was equal parts beautiful and terrifying. The full moon reflected perfectly on the still water, creating a circle of silver light. Stalactites gleamed like crystal daggers. The silence was absolute. Even the omnipresent sounds of the jungle seemed to have fallen quiet in respect or in fear. The group dispersed around the cenote, each person absorbed in the beauty of the moment. The Harrisons stood hand in hand on a rocky ledge. Sarah Chen was trying to capture the moonlight on film. Eric Johansson prepared for a night dive. Pierre Dubois wrote poetically in his notebook. The Delgados shared an intimate newlywed moment. It was a scene of perfect peace, the last moment of tranquility before hell was unleashed. At 12:30 a.m. on July 23rd, they arrived. 6 men emerged from the jungle like shadows, moving with professional precision. They weren't common narcos or opportunistic thieves. These were professional looters, men who had done this before. They were dressed in black, wearing ski masks, armed with assault rifles and machetes. They carried rappelling gear and powerful lamps. They knew every entrance and exit of the cenote. But the true horror came when a 7th figure emerged from the shadows. Don Alberto, unmasked, without pretense. It no longer mattered if they saw him. He stood at the edge of the cenote, his silhouette framed against the moon, and spoke with a calm that was more terrifying than any scream. He explained the situation with the brutal simplicity of a businessman explaining a transaction. They had seen too much. The tomb they found was worth $10 million on the international market. He couldn't risk them talking, publishing, or alerting the authorities. Klaus Hoffmann, ever the negotiator, immediately offered to buy their silence. He had money, connections. He could make it worth everyone's while. Sarah Chen promised to destroy all her photographs, to hand over the film. Roberto Mendez appealed in Mayan to the local men in the group, reminding them of the respect for life their ancestors taught. Isabella Rossi swore on her mother's life she would never say a word. Pierre Dubois offered to write whatever Don Alberto wanted in his guidebooks, to steer tourists away from the area. Don Alberto listened to all the pleas with a sad smile. When they had all finished begging, he simply said, "But in this business, dead Mayans are worth more than living tourists, and the dead don't talk." Then he gave the signal. Isabella Rossi was first. She tried to run for the jungle but didn't make it 5 meters. A clean shot to the back of the head. Her body pitched forward, rolled down the rocky slope, and sank into the cenote with a splash that echoed like thunder in the silence. Her scream, cut in half, hung in the air like a ghostly echo. Panic erupted. Michael Harrison, a retired Marine, wasn't going to die without a fight. He lunged at the nearest gunman, managed to tackle him, and they struggled for the weapon. But another man came up from behind and sank a machete between his ribs. Jennifer screamed his name and ran to her dying husband. They let her reach him, let her hold him as he bled out, and then they shot them both. They died as they had lived, together. Eric Johansson had an idea that might have saved him in other circumstances. He dove into the cenote, swimming deep, seeking one of the underwater caverns he had explored earlier. With his experience, he could hold his breath longer than most. He could find an air pocket, he could wait. But the looters knew the cenote as well as he did. They knew exactly where the cavern exits were. When Eric emerged, gasping, in an internal air chamber, believing he was safe, a machete was waiting for him. The crystal water of the sacred cenote was stained red. 15 people who only wanted an adventure, condemned for being in the wrong place at the wrong time. Or perhaps the right place, because someone had to be a witness. The Latin Americans tried to appeal to cultural solidarity. They spoke in Spanish. They begged. They reminded the men that they were all Latino brothers. Carlos Delgado didn't try to run or fight. Instead, he embraced Maria, his wife of only 3 months, and shielded her with his body. They were shot like that, in an embrace. It took multiple shots because Carlos wouldn't move, wouldn't let the bullets reach Maria. They died as they had promised at their wedding, together, until death did them part, and not even then. Roberto Mendez, the only Mexican in the tourist group, began to pray in ancient Mayan. It was a prayer his grandmother had taught him, a plea to the old gods for protection. The local gunman paused for a moment, clearly affected. But Don Alberto had no time for superstition. He ordered them to beat him into silence. Roberto kept praying even as they kicked him, the Mayan words mixing with blood in his mouth. He only fell silent when he could no longer breathe. Carmen Silva, the Brazilian curator, didn't beg or try to flee. Instead, she cursed the killers with a fury that startled even the gunmen. She told them the Mayan gods would punish them, that every stolen piece would carry their curse, that they would die choking on their own blood just as they were drowning innocents. Don Alberto walked over personally and shot her in the mouth, saying he'd heard enough curses in his lifetime. The more pragmatic Europeans tried to scatter in different directions, hoping at least some might escape. Pierre Dubois ran for the jungle, using his knowledge of survival. They hunted him like an animal for 15 minutes. They could have shot him immediately, but they seemed to enjoy the chase. When they finally cornered him against a ceiba tree, he was weeping and calling for his mother in French. Anna Souza, the journalist, had a moment of professional lucidity even in the midst of the terror. She activated the recorder she always carried in her pocket and hid it among the rocks just before they reached her. She recorded her last words in Portuguese, stating her name, the date, the place, and naming Don Alberto. The recorder was never found, but Manuel swears that sometimes on the quietest nights you can still hear Portuguese whispers near the cenote. Greta Hoffmann died begging for the life of her husband, Klaus, who was already floating face down in the water. She didn't know he was already gone. She kept promising anything if they would just let him live. They let her plead for 5 eternal minutes before they slensed her. Her body fell into the cenote, landing beside Klaus. Even in death, the cenote brought them together. Lisa Anderson, the youngest at 24, almost made it. She hid in a crevice between the rocks, a space so small she could barely fit. She curled into a ball and held her breath. It might have worked. The sicarios were already busy with the others. But the terror was too much. She began to cry, silent, body-racking sobs. One of the hitmen heard the nearly imperceptible sound. It was Don Alberto himself who pulled her from her hiding place, dragging her by the hair as she screamed and kicked. He looked into her eyes, the eyes of a girl who could have been his own daughter. For a moment he seemed to hesitate. Then, with genuine sadness in his voice, he said she reminded him of his Lupita at that age, and shot her in the forehead. The cynicism of killing someone who reminded him of his own child was the final, sickening flourish on a night already impossible to process. 45 minutes. That was all it took to murder 15 people. 45 minutes to destroy 15 lives, 15 futures, 15 stories. The Cenote, sacred to the Maya as an entrance to the underworld, had literally become one. 15 souls sent to Xibalba, not by divine will but by human greed. The sicarios, professional to the end, began the work of hiding the evidence. With ropes and stones they weighed down the bodies to sink them to the bottom. Manuel was forced to help, promised that if he refused he would be number 16. With trembling hands and tears streaming down his face, he helped tie stones to the ankles of people he had shared a meal with just hours before. The work took all night. They had to ensure the bodies wouldn't float, that the subterranean currents wouldn't carry them to accessible caverns. Some became snagged on ledges at different depths, creating a column of death from the surface to the bottom. Don Alberto supervised the entire operation with the meticulous care of a funeral director, ensuring every last detail was perfect. As the sun began to rise over the Mayan jungle, staining the sky blood red, the work was finished. 15 tourists lay at the bottom of the Cenote, most at a depth of 60 meters, though some were caught on ledges in between. Don Alberto gathered his team and gave them their final instructions. The official story would be simple. The group had gotten lost in the jungle. They probably fell into an unmapped cenote while looking for water. Joaquin and Manuel had searched all night without success. But there was a problem Don Alberto hadn't fully anticipated. Sarah Chen, ever the professional, had sent a few photographs via satellite modem to National Geographic the previous afternoon. Not the photos of the tomb. Those were still in her camera, now submerged. But she had sent pictures of the group, of the cenotes they had visited, with approximate GPS coordinates. There would be questions, investigations, international pressure. Don Alberto cursed modern technology. In the old days, you could make a group of hippies disappear and nobody would ask too many questions. But now, with satellite communications, with families expecting daily calls, with employers tracking their people, it was more complicated. He ordered them to activate Plan B, a massive campaign of disinformation and bribery that would involve local, state, and even federal authorities. On July 23rd at noon, Manuel and Joaquin returned to Playa del Carmen with their story rehearsed down to the last detail. The vans had supposedly broken down in the middle of the jungle. The group, impatient and overconfident in their survival skills, had decided to walk for help instead of waiting. They had separated from the guides and become lost in the dense vegetation. Manuel and Joaquin had searched all night, screaming names until they were hoarse, firing flares, all useless in the vastness of the jungle. It was a believable story. The Quintana Roo jungle in 1994 was vast, wild, and dangerous. Every year, backpackers who ventured off the marked trails disappeared. There were jaguars, venomous snakes, cenotes hidden by vegetation where someone could fall and never be found. Tourists, especially foreigners, often overestimated their abilities and underestimated the dangers of the tropical rainforest. They arrived at the mystical Maya Tours office, where Don Alberto had already set the stage. He had alerted the authorities early that morning, reporting that the group had not returned as scheduled. There were crocodile tears in his eyes as he spoke with the police commander of Solidaridad, the municipality that included Playa del Carmen. Of course, Commander Raúl Echeverría already knew exactly what had happened. The briefcase with 200,000 pesos he had received that morning guaranteed his full cooperation. The agency's secretary, Doña Marta, an older woman who had worked there for years, noticed something was wrong. She saw blood on Manuel's shoes. His hands were shaking uncontrollably, and Joaquin reeked of alcohol, though it was barely noon. When she asked about the blood, Joaquin quickly said that Manuel had cut himself on sharp rocks while searching a cave. The explanation made sense, but the way Manuel flinched when she looked at him told her there was more to the story. By July 24th, the international pressure had begun. The U.S. Embassy was asking about its 5 citizens. The Germans were especially insistent about the Hoffmans. The Brazilian embassy wanted to know about Carmen Silva. National Geographic was pushing hard for its star photographer, threatening to send its own search team. Families were calling every hour, growing more desperate. Don Alberto activated his network of corruption with the efficiency of an orchestra conductor. Commander Echeverría organized a massive official search in an area 30 kilometers south of where everything had actually happened. Helicopters flew over the jungle. Dozens of volunteers combed the brush. Search dogs sniffed items of clothing from the missing. It was all an elaborate spectacle, a performance for the cameras and the desperate families. Manuel was forced to participate in this charade. He had to point to places on maps where they had never been, lead search parties down trails that led nowhere, pretend to recognize areas where the group might have strayed. Every lie was a knife in his conscience. The most difficult moment came when Michael Harrison's wife arrived from San Francisco. The woman, shattered but determined, approached Manuel with photos of her husband and sister-in-law. She begged him, tears streaming down her face, to please remember any detail, anything that could help find them. Manuel had to look her in the eyes and lie, telling her that her husband seemed like a capable man who had surely found shelter somewhere. The effort of maintaining the lie was too much. Manuel ran to the bathroom and vomited until only bile was left. The others said it was just stress and the heat. Only he knew it was the guilt. The media swallowed the story whole. Headlines spoke of 15 tourists lost in the Mayan jungle, a tragedy that served as a warning about the dangers of venturing into wild areas without proper preparation. Don Alberto, a master of manipulation, leaked information that subtly blamed the victims. He suggested the group had insisted on exploring on their own despite the guide's warnings, that some had been drinking at dinner, that they had ignored basic safety protocols. A week after the massacre on July 30th, Manuel couldn't take the guilt anymore. He hadn't slept since that night. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the faces of the dead. He heard Isabella's choked scream, Lisa's weeping, Roberto's prayers in Mayan. He decided he had to tell someone or he would go insane. Father Jose had been a friend of the Zib family for generations. He had baptized Manuel, had officiated his parents' wedding. If there was anyone Manuel could trust, it was him. That afternoon, Manuel went to the small church in his village and told Father Jose everything in confession. The old priest listened in horror as Manuel described each death, each ignored plea, each gunshot. Father Jose promised to help. He told Manuel this could not stand, that justice had to be done. He promised to speak with the bishop, even with federal authorities who weren't on the take. He gave Manuel absolution and told him to pray for the souls of the 15 martyrs. That night, Father Jose suffered a massive heart attack. He was found dead in his bed, an expression of terror on his face. The message to Manuel was as clear as water. There was no one he could turn to. Don Alberto visited Manuel the day after Father Jose's funeral. He didn't come alone. He brought two of his men, the same ones who had participated in the massacre. He sat in the humble living room of Manuel's house as if he owned the world. He took out an envelope and placed it on the rickety table. Inside were photos. Manuel's mother leaving the market, his two younger sisters walking to school, his girlfriend Rosa at her job as a seamstress. Don Alberto didn't have to say much. The implications were clear. Then he took out another envelope. This one was full of cash. 50,000 pesos, more money than Manuel would see in 5 years of honest work. He placed it next to the photos. "For your silence and loyalty," Don Alberto said in that paternal voice he used for the worst threats. "Or for your family's funerals, you decide, mijo." In August, the other problematic witness was eliminated. Joaquin Herrera had been drinking uncontrollably since the night of the massacre. The alcohol made him talk, muttering names, dates, details. One night, in a cantina in Playa del Carmen, drunk to the point of incoherence, he began to cry and beg for forgiveness from the dead gringos. Someone heard him and reported back to Don Alberto. The next morning, Joaquin's body was found in the Cenote Cristalino, one of the most popular tourist spots in the area. The official story was suicide, that the guilt of having lost the tourists had driven him to take his own life. They even held a funeral with honors, painting him as a hero who had died of grief because he couldn't save his clients. Manuel went to the funeral, saw the closed casket, and knew that he was now the only living witness, besides the killers themselves. Don Alberto decided Manuel also needed a more permanent reminder of the consequences of talking. On August 15th, as Manuel was walking home after buying tortillas, a truck tried to run him over. Manuel jumped aside just in time, but a man was waiting for him. A machete cut deep into his left side, from his ribs to his hip. As Manuel lay bleeding on the ground, the man leaned over and whispered, "Next time we won't miss. Keep your mouth shut or your family will pay." What saved Manuel was his uncle Don Sebastian Gib, a respected shmen throughout the region. The shmen are the Mayan shamans, guardians of ancient knowledge, intermediaries between the world of the living and the world of the spirits. Don Sebastian held real power in the Mayan communities, a power that even Don Alberto respected, or, more accurately, feared. Don Sebastian went to see Don Alberto and negotiated for his nephew's life. He swore on the ancient Mayan gods that Manuel would keep silent forever. But he also warned that if anything happened to Manuel, he would personally see to it that the curse of the cenotes fell upon Don Alberto and his entire bloodline. "The cenotes have a memory," he told him, "and those drowned in sacred water do not rest until they have justice." Don Alberto, who considered himself a modern and rational man, would normally have laughed at such superstitions. But there was something in the old shaman's eyes, something in the way the lights flickered when he uttered his warning, that made him hesitate. Besides, Manuel was already broken, terrified, and controlled, leaving him alive as an example to others who might think of speaking had its own value. He accepted the deal. Manuel would live, but he would be watched, always. In September, after a month and a half of a theatrical search, Mexican authorities officially declared the 15 tourists dead by accidental causes. With no bodies to recover and no evidence of foul play, the case was closed. The families were devastated, but they had no options. Some hired private investigators, but they were fed false leads, or if they got too close to the truth, they would simply disappear or suddenly decide the case was unsolvable. 30 years living with 15 ghosts, threatened, watched, guilty for surviving, Manuel paid the highest price for witnessing the massacre. How many others live with similar secrets in Mexico's tourist paradise? Share to give a voice to the silenced. Like to support brave witnesses. Comment if you know someone who lives with a similar fear. The first years after the massacre were a personalized hell for Manuel. He married Rosa in 1995, his teenage sweetheart who had waited for him faithfully. He never told her anything about that night, but Rosa was not a fool. She knew something terrible had happened in July of '94, something that had fundamentally changed the man she loved. Manuel talked in his sleep, shouting foreign names: Jennifer, Michael, Eric, Lisa. Sometimes he would wake up crying, muttering, "Forgive me" in Mayan, Spanish, and English. Rosa did what she could. She made him chamomile tea for his nerves. She held him when the night tremors shook his body. She cleaned the sheets when the cold sweat soaked through them. She thought they were just nightmares from the jungle, perhaps a close encounter with death. He couldn't get over. She never imagined that her husband carried the weight of 15 murders he couldn't prevent. They had 3 children, Manuel Jr. Manuel Jr. was born in 1996, Rosa Maria in 1998, and little Sebastian in 2000. Manuel swore his children would grow up far from the world of tourism, far from the cenotes he now considered cursed. He found a job in construction, a cruel irony of fate. The Riviera Maya was in the midst of a development boom, and Manuel ended up building the very resorts that buried the jungle and, all too often, the archaeological sites within it. Whenever the excavators unearthed ancient pottery or bones that were clearly not animal, the engineers would make a call. Sometimes, archaeologists from the National Institute of Anthropology and History would arrive. But more often, it was men who worked for Don Alberto, who had since become one of the most powerful hotel developers in the region. Manuel watched the cycle repeat itself: plunder, destruction, silence. And he remained silent, collecting his miserable salary and drinking to forget. Alcohol became his only escape. Beer after work, tequila on the weekends, anything to numb the memories. Rosa put up with it for years, but the alcohol made Manuel talk in his sleep. One night, completely drunk, he told her fragments of the story. He spoke of the 15 of the Cenote of Don Alberto. Rosa listened in horror, but when Manuel woke the next morning and she tried to ask him about it, he denied everything. He said it was just a nightmare, nothing more. The anniversaries were the worst. Every July 23rd, Manuel would fall mysteriously ill. He couldn't get out of bed. He would vomit for no reason, trembling as if with a fever. Rosa learned to mark the date on her calendar and prepare. Over the years, she also noticed how certain news stories affected him disproportionately. Whenever reports surfaced about missing tourists, about cenotes, about archaeological discoveries, Manuel would turn pale and lock himself in his room. The families of the disappeared did not give up easily. For the first 5 years, some of them returned every anniversary. Klaus Hofmann's wife came from Germany 5 times. Each time she was thinner, more gaunt, clinging to the impossible hope that her husband might be alive somewhere. She hired local guides, organized searches, and put up posters with the photos of the missing. Manuel would see her from a distance when she visited the tourist cenotes, asking if anyone had seen anything unusual back in July of '94. Once, she approached him in the market. She didn't recognize him as one of the original guides, but she showed him the picture of Klaus and Greta, asking in broken Spanish if he had seen them. Manuel could only shake his head as his heart shattered. He wanted to scream the truth at her, to tell her where the bodies were, but the photos of his own children in his wallet weighed more than his conscience. Lisa Anderson's mother was another persistent visitor. She came every year until 2003, when she died of a heart attack. She had spent her entire inheritance searching for her daughter, hiring private investigators, bribing officials, begging anyone who would listen. Manuel saw her once crying in the town church, clutching a photo of Lisa pleading with the Virgin of Guadalupe to bring her little girl back. He was sitting 3 pews away, knowing exactly where Lisa was, unable to give the woman the peace of knowing. Pierre Dubois's brother was more methodical. He hired a Mexican private detective who seemed genuinely competent. The detective started asking the right questions, following the real leads. He even managed to interview former employees of mystical Maya tours. He came dangerously close to the truth. Then suddenly he abandoned the case. He told Pierre's brother there was nothing to find, that it was best to accept that his brother had been lost in the jungle. Manuel later learned that the detective had received a late-night visit that convinced him of the importance of maintaining his health. Between 2001 and 2010, the Riviera Maya underwent a total transformation. Playa del Carmen went from a small town to a cosmopolitan city filled with luxury condos and shopping malls. Cancun expanded south, Tulum expanded north, and a continuous strip of tourist development grew between them. Don Alberto prospered like never before, laundering the money from his archaeological plunder through perfectly legal real estate developments. Manuel would see photos of him in the newspapers. Now, Don Alberto Sanchez, a respectable businessman and philanthropist. There were pictures of him donating money to schools, being decorated by the governor, cutting ribbons at new hospitals. Every smile in those photos was a slap in the face to Manuel. This man, who had ordered the murder of 15 innocent people, was being celebrated as a benefactor of Quintana Roo. The other killers also prospered grotesquely. Commander Echeverria became a local, then a federal congressman. He spoke in Congress about security and justice with the same mouth that had ordered a massacre covered up. The Canul brothers, who had been the lead enforcers, now owned a chain of seafood restaurants. They served ceviche and shrimp cocktails where they had once served death. In 2008, Manuel almost spoke again. An American journalist, John Patterson, was investigating a series of old disappearances in the Riviera Maya for a book. Somehow, he had gotten Manuel's name as someone who had worked for mystical Maya tours in the 90s. He contacted him discreetly, promising to protect his source, suggesting he knew more than he was letting on. Manuel agreed to meet him at a bar on the outskirts of Playa del Carmen. He arrived determined to tell him everything. But as he waited, he received a phone call. It was Rosa, crying hysterically. Manuel Jr., his eldest son, now 12, had been in an accident. Some men on a motorcycle had beaten him unconscious. He was in the hospital, serious but stable. Manuel understood the message. He got up and left without waiting for the journalist. His son recovered miraculously fast, but with a scar on his forehead that would serve as a permanent reminder. The years of sickness began in 2011. Rosa developed uterine cancer, likely from the stress of living with a man who was broken inside. The treatments were expensive, Social Security didn't cover everything, and Manuel earned little in construction. In his desperation, he did the unthinkable. He went to borrow money from Don Alberto. The old monster, now 72 and sick with diabetes himself, received him in his mansion overlooking the sea. The study was decorated with Mayan art, pieces Manuel recognized with a sickening horror. Some of them had likely come from the very tomb the 15 tourists had found. Don Alberto lent him the money without hesitation, but not without a price. He reminded Manuel of the cost of silence. He showed him recent photos of his children, now teenagers. "Your children are growing up handsome," he said with that poisonous fatherly voice. "It would be a tragedy if they were orphaned of both mother and father." Rosa fought the cancer for 7 years. Manuel cared for her with a devotion that tried to compensate for all his silences. In her final months, when morphine kept her in a state between waking and sleep, she spoke to him with surprising clarity. She told him she knew he carried something terrible, that she had lived all these years knowing her husband kept a secret that was killing him slowly. She forgave him, she said. She loved him despite it all. And she asked one thing of him, that when she was gone, when he no longer had to protect her, he would speak, that he would give peace to the dead because the unquiet dead do not let the living live. Rosa died in March of 2018 on a Sunday afternoon as Manuel held her hand. Her last words were, "Speak when you can, my love. The dead need to rest, and so do you." Manuel wept as he hadn't wept since that night in the cenote, a cry that came from 30 years of dammed-up guilt. Without Rosa, the house became unbearably empty. His children, now adults, had moved on. Manuel Jr. worked in a hotel in Cancun, having studied tourism administration despite his father's objections. Rosa Maria was married and lived in Mérida, and little Sebastian, no longer little, was studying engineering in Mexico City. They visited infrequently, made uncomfortable by their father's obvious decline. Manuel began talking to himself more and more. Neighbors would see him walking to the tourist cenotes, standing at the edge and speaking to the water. They thought it was premature senile dementia, but Manuel was asking for forgiveness. Sometimes he would say names: Jennifer, Michael, Sarah, Klaus, Greta, Pierre, Isabella, Eric, Anna, Carlos, Maria, Roberto, Carmen, Lisa. 15 names he recited like a rosary of guilt. 30 years is a lifetime of sleepless nights. A lifetime of pretending everything is fine. Manuel sacrificed his peace of mind to protect his family. Now, alone and old, he chose truth over safety. In November of 2024, after Don Alberto's death in 2021 and with most of the other culprits either dead or too old to be a threat, Manuel finally made his decision. He contacted an investigative journalist from Mexico City through carefully chosen intermediaries. Once the dam of silence broke, the words flowed like a river bursting its banks. 20 hours of recorded testimony, every detail seared into his memory with the cruel clarity of trauma. Manuel remembered each of the victims not as statistics but as whole people. Jennifer Harrison had a contagious laugh and was constantly taking pictures of her husband Michael when he wasn't looking. You could tell that even after 8 years of marriage, they were still in love like teenagers. Sarah Chen was brilliant. Her eyes lit up when she talked about her work, about how photography could change the world by showing hidden truths. She had shown Manuel photos from her other projects: the temples of Angkor, the tribes of the Amazon, the monasteries of Tibet. Klaus Hofmann was a cultured man who could talk for hours about Mesoamerican art, but he wasn't a cold academic. He genuinely loved the culture, respected its value beyond any price. That was what made him dangerous. He understood exactly what they were looking at in that tomb. Greta, his wife, had terrible Spanish, but she tried with such enthusiasm, making everyone laugh with her grammatical mistakes. Pierre Dubois was constantly writing, filling notebooks with observations that went beyond the tourist-level view. He noticed details others missed: the poverty of the Mayan villages next to the tourist developments, the way the locals lowered their eyes when certain cars passed, the nervousness of Joaquin that others attributed to professional responsibility. Isabella Rossi had a genuine passion for cultural preservation. When she saw the tomb, she didn't think of its monetary value, but of its historical importance, of what it could teach us about the ancient Maya. She spoke of establishing a proper excavation protocol, of contacting the right universities. Her professional enthusiasm was her death sentence. Erik Johansson was a Swedish giant with the heart of a child. He was as excited by every dive as if it were his first. He had a primitive GoPro camera that he had modified to record underwater. He had promised his girlfriend in Stockholm he would bring her videos of the cenotes. He was never able to keep that promise. For the journalist, Manuel drew a detailed map of Cenote Chak, every entrance, every recess. He pointed to the exact spot where each person fell. Isabella was the first. She fell here, rolled down these rocks. The Harrisons died together here. Their bodies fell intertwined. Eric surfaced in this air pocket before they killed him. Lisa hid in this crevice. You can barely see it from above. The cenote is 60 meters at its deepest point, he explained. But there are ledges at different depths. At 40 meters, there is a shelf where some of the bodies got caught. The underwater currents are complex. Some lead to unexplored chambers, others circle endlessly. It's possible some of the bodies have moved over the years, but most of them should be where they fell, preserved by the cold water and the darkness. Manuel revealed that they were not the only ones. From half-heard conversations, from the drunken boasts of the enforcers, from careless comments made by Don Alberto, he had pieced together information about other disappearances. He estimated that between 1990 and 1995, at least 40 or 50 people had vanished on similar tours. The 15 were the largest group, but there were couples, individuals, small groups. Every time a valuable archaeological site was discovered, someone paid the price. He described the network of tunnels the looters had created or expanded. Some were natural, connected cenotes. Others were pre-Hispanic tunnels widened with dynamite. It was an entire subterranean world where they moved the stolen pieces, where they stored them before smuggling them out of the country. He gave approximate coordinates for the entrances he remembered, though he warned that many might have been sealed or altered. With fear no longer paralyzing him, Manuel gave full names. Don Alberto Sanchez Monteverde, the mastermind, dead in 2021, but with children who inherited his empire. Commander Raúl Echeverría, now a senator, who coordinated the cover-up. The Canul brothers, Jorge and Pedro, the lead enforcers, now prosperous businessmen. Joaquin Herrera, the complicit guide who committed suicide in August of '94. And at least 15 more names of people involved at different levels. Manuel also remembered details about the fate of the archaeological pieces. He had helped load some of them before his warning accident. A perfect jade mask that Don Alberto said was going to a collector in Switzerland. A gold necklace that would end up in a private museum in Japan. A codex on tree bark that a Texan oil tycoon had specifically commissioned. Millennia-old sacred Mayan art stained with the blood of innocents now decorating the mansions of millionaires. The journalist asked him about physical proof, and then Manuel revealed what he had guarded for 30 years. Robert Miller's notebook, which he had hidden before they burned all the belongings. Pages and pages of meticulous observations about the tomb, about the artifacts, about the irregularities he had noticed on the tour. A roll of film from Sarah Chen that she had given him to hold while they were diving, which he had never developed for fear of what it might show. And the passports. 15 passports he was supposed to have destroyed but couldn't. Every time he tried to burn them, he saw the faces in the photos, so alive, so full of hope. He had wrapped them in plastic and buried them under the family altar. A macabre offering to the dead he could never forget, but the most crucial piece of evidence might still be waiting in the cenote. Jennifer Harrison had been recording with her video camera until almost the very end. In the chaos of the massacre, Manuel had hidden it in a deep crevice wrapped in a waterproof bag Jennifer had brought. If it survived 30 years in the cold darkness of the cenote, it could hold the group's final hours, perhaps even the beginning of the slaughter. Every detail preserved for 3 decades, every name, every date. Manuel is a living encyclopedia of the horror that unfolded. If you believe he deserves justice, that the 15 deserve justice, you must act. Share this story far and wide. Tag the authorities. Demand a real investigation. Hit the like button to give Manuel strength. Comment. Justice for the 15. In December of 2024, following Manuel's testimony, an unofficial team of forensic divers and archaeologists organized a secret expedition to the Cenote. They couldn't trust the local authorities, many of whom were still connected to the old powers. Manuel, despite being 49 years old, despite his diabetes and the terror that still gripped him, insisted on guiding the expedition. It was his way of fulfilling the promise he had made to Rosa. The Cenote was just as beautiful and terrible as he remembered. The crystal-clear water, which seemed to invite a swim, concealed a deadly depth. Manuel stood at the edge in the exact spot where Don Alberto had stood that night and began to pray in Mayan. He asked permission from the dead to disturb their rest, promising it was to bring them justice, not further desecration. The professional divers descended with high-definition cameras and powerful lights. At 20 meters, the water grew colder. Sunlight no longer reached this far. At 30 meters, the darkness was nearly absolute, broken only by their artificial beams. At 40 meters on the ledge Manuel had described, they made their first find. Scattered human bones, some still clinging to tattered shreds of fabric. A Casio digital watch, the kind popular in the 90s, stopped at 1:47 a.m. The divers documented everything without touching a thing, respecting the scene as the forensic site it was. Manuel, watching the images on a screen at the surface, recognized the plaid shirt. Pierre Dubois had been wearing it that night. At 50 meters, more remains. A skull with obviously expensive dental work, likely North American or European. Nearby, a wedding ring with an inscription the cameras were able to capture. JNM Forever, 1987. Jennifer and Michael Harrison still together after 30 years, just as they had promised. Manuel wept openly, without shame. Finally, someone else knew where they were. At the bottom, 60 meters down, visibility was minimal. 3 decades of sediment had accumulated, but the expert divers knew what to look for. More bones, scattered by subterranean currents, but enough to confirm multiple individuals. Hiking boots from the 90s, disintegrated backpacks with their metal buckles still intact. A professional Nikon camera that could have belonged to Sarah Chen. And then, they found it. The Hi8 video camera in its watertight case tucked into a deep crevice, just as Manuel had described. 30 years in total darkness in water of a constant temperature. The experts said there was a chance the tape had survived. If it held what Manuel believed, it would be irrefutable proof. Every detail of Manuel's testimony was confirmed by the physical evidence. The location of the bodies, the personal objects, even the marks on the rocks where there had been a struggle. Forensics estimated between 12 and 15 individuals based on the remains. Exactly what Manuel had said. Preliminary identification, though still without DNA tests, was possible thanks to personal belongings. A laminated German passport, Klaus Hoffmann. A St. Christopher medal with a Portuguese inscription. Ana Sousa. A specialized Suunto diving compass. Eric Johansson. A waterproof notebook filled with geological equations. Carlos Delgado. Following Manuel's other directions, the team found the remains of the campsite. 30 years of jungle growth had covered it, but the archaeologists knew what to look for. The remnants of a fire pit, rusted cans from the 90s, and most importantly, buried under a pile of stones, a metal briefcase that had belonged to Carlos Delgado. Inside, protected from time, were the maps and drawings Carlos had made of the tomb they had found. Detailed sketches of every piece, measurements, descriptions. If compared with art auction catalogs from the late 90s, it would be possible to trace exactly where the stolen artifacts ended up. Definitive proof of the motive for the murders. The official reaction was immediate, but lukewarm. The Quintana Roo prosecutor's office couldn't ignore the evidence, but many of those involved were either dead or protected by political power. Don Alberto's son, Alberto Jr., now one of the most powerful hoteliers on the Riviera Maya, hired a team of lawyers who immediately began to talk about statutes of limitation, a broken chain of custody, and uncorroborated testimony. Senator Echeverria, the former commander who had covered it all up, had constitutional immunity. Publicly, he expressed his shock and horror at the revelations, promising to support a thorough investigation. Privately, his lawyers were already preparing defenses, arguing he had been misled and had acted on the information available at the time. The victims' families, those who were still alive, had mixed reactions. Some were grateful to finally know the truth. Lisa Anderson's sister, now 56, flew in from California immediately. She cried knowing her sister had died for being an incidental witness to a crime, but at least now she could properly lay her to rest. The Harrison's son, who was 5 when his parents disappeared, now 35, expressed a mixture of relief and rage. Relief at finally knowing, rage that those responsible had lived 3 decades in freedom and prosperity while he grew up an orphan. Other relatives cursed Manuel for waiting so long. Why didn't he speak sooner? Why did he let them suffer through 30 years of uncertainty? They couldn't understand the weight of the terror he had lived under, the threats against his family, the price he had paid in his mental and physical health for his forced silence. The evidence is there, 60 meters under the water, waiting for justice after 30 years. Manuel risked everything to lead the authorities to it. Will it be enough? Or will power continue to protect the murderers, share to apply pressure, like to support the investigation? Comment if you believe there will be real justice. As I write this in January of 2025, Manuel Jibkovic is living under informal protection, not from the government he distrusts, but from journalists and activists who understand the value of his testimony. At 49 years old, diabetic and alone, he is, for the first time in 3 decades, at peace with himself. He fulfilled the promise he made to Rosa on her deathbed. He spoke when he could. The dead of the Cenote finally have a voice. The official investigation faces monumental obstacles. Many of those directly responsible are dead. Don Alberto died in his bed in 2021, surrounded by luxuries bought with blood. Joaquin was silenced in 1994. Several of the hitmen died in the following years, some in gangland disputes, others of old age. Those who survive now have power, money, influence, and lawyers. The legal arguments are complex. The statute of limitations is a major hurdle after 30 years. Defense attorneys argue that Manuel's testimony without a living corroborating witness is not enough. The physical evidence, though compelling, was recovered without an official chain of custody. Jennifer Harrison's videotape, if it contains anything, is still undergoing forensic analysis. The families remain divided in their response. Some are infinitely grateful to Manuel for finally giving them closure. They can bury their dead, even if only symbolically. They can stop wondering what happened. Others curse him for his 3 decades of silence, unable to forgive that their loved ones lay in a cenote while he lived, married, and had children. The impact on the Riviera Maya has been significant but temporary. For a few weeks, tourists canceled cenote tours. Tour operators swore that everything was different now, safe, regulated. But money speaks louder than fear, and soon the tours filled up again. The tourism machine cannot be stopped by ghosts from 30 years ago. But there are deeper, less visible changes. Inspired by Manuel, other old guides have begun to speak. Stories of other missing groups, of threats, of silence bought or forced. A long-buried network of truth is emerging, like the cenotes themselves revealed when the water level drops. Manuel now reflects on his decision. He doesn't regret speaking, though the price is high. His children don't fully understand why he put the family at risk for people who died 30 years ago. They are angry, scared. Some are not speaking to him, but Manuel knows he did the right thing. He no longer dreams of the 15 every night. Now, when they appear in his dreams, they no longer look at him with reproach, but with something akin to gratitude. Or perhaps that is just his hope. The legacy of this confession goes beyond the possibility of legal justice, which seems increasingly unlikely. It is a warning about the true price of unregulated tourism, about what happens when development is prioritized above all else. The 15 tourists who died in the Cenote were not victims of the Mayan jungle, but of human savagery disguised as progress. The cenotes are still beautiful. They still attract millions of tourists every year. Most swim in their crystal-clear waters, unaware that some are tombs, that beneath the beauty lies a history of blood. And maybe it's better that way. Or maybe not. Manuel is no longer sure of anything except for one thing. The dead deserve to be remembered. Their names deserve to be spoken. Jennifer and Michael Harrison, Sarah Chen, Klaus and Greta Hoffman, Pierre Dubois, Isabella Rossi, Eric Johansson, Ana Sousa, Carlos and Maria Delgado, Roberto Mendez, Carmen Silva, Lisa Anderson. 15 names, 15 lives, 15 stories cut short by greed. May their names not be forgotten. May their deaths not have been completely in vain. Manuel Jibkovich waited 30 years to confess that 15 tourists did not get lost in the Mayan jungle but were systematically executed for witnessing archaeological looting. Their bodies thrown into the sacred cenote as unwitting offerings to human greed. And although his late testimony unleashed a search for justice that seems destined to fail, it at least returned names and dignity to those devoured by the Caribbean paradise, proving that sometimes a 19-year-old Mayan guide can carry the weight of 15 ghosts for 3 decades until the weight of the silence becomes heavier than the fear. And the truth, though late and likely insufficient for justice, can shine brighter than the crystal waters that hide the bones of the innocent. This story proves that extreme tourism can be deadly when it crosses paths with criminal interests. Manuel risked everything to speak after 30 years. Will his courage amount to anything? That depends on you. Subscribe now to this channel that does not forget. Share this on all your networks with the hashtags #Justice and #Justice for the Cenote 15. Hit the like button to give strength to Manuel and the families. Leave a comment for each of the 15 victims. Activate all notifications because we will follow this case until there is justice, or until it is proven that in Mexico impunity runs deeper than any cenote.